I came home expecting a warm hug after a long week at an academic conference. Instead, I found the locks changed and a note taped to the door. Our marriage is over. Contact my attorney. 15 years of commitment reduced to a single sentence. No warning, no conversation. Just exile from my own home. I stood there suitcase in hand, realizing I wasn't just locked out of my house. I was locked out of the life I thought I knew. When I tried calling my wife Elizabeth, she didn't pick up. When I reached out to friends, they avoided me. And then the whispers started, stories about how I was emotionally abusive, how I had threatened her, lies, all of it. But Elizabeth didn't know one thing. While she was busy rewriting our history, I held a truth she never saw coming. If your world collapsed overnight and the person you trusted most turned you into a villain, what would you do? Stay with me. Because this isn't just a story about betrayal, it's about how I turned the tables without ever raising my voice. And if you don't want to miss stories like this, make sure to subscribe. I wasn't always the kind of man who kept secrets. In fact, I built my life and my marriage on honesty. At least that's what I believed. My name is William Harrington. I'm a college professor in Savannah, Georgia. I teach philosophy, ethics to be exact. Kind of ironic, isn't it? Elizabeth and I met when we were both just starting out. She was a young interior designer with big dreams. I was a freshly minted professor, eager to make a difference in the classroom. We didn't have much, just ambition in each other. Back then, it felt like us against the world. We rented a tiny apartment downtown, shared late-night dinners of instant noodles, and talked about the future, like it was something we could shape with our bare hands. When I got my tenure, we celebrated with cheap wine and promises. We bought a modest house, not too big, but enough to call our own. Elizabeth's design business started to grow, and I was proud to support her whenever she needed extra funds. That's what marriage is, right? Partnership, sacrifice, believing in each other. Or so I thought. What I never told Elizabeth, what I never thought I needed to tell her, was that I came from old money. My grandfather was a shrewd businessman who believed that wealth could spoil a man if he didn't learn to stand on his own first. So he set up a trust fund for me. It would only become accessible when I turned 45. Until then, I lived entirely on my professor's salary, paying bills, saving modestly, contributing equally to our life. I didn't hide it out of malice. I just didn't see the point of bringing it up. We were comfortable. And I believed Elizabeth loved me, not whatever legacy my family had tucked away. For 15 years, I thought we were building something real. Sure, we had our disagreements. What couple doesn't? But nothing. Nothing that ever made me question her loyalty. Looking back, I realize how blind I was. Elizabeth's late nights at client meetings, her sudden obsession with image designer clothes, expensive dinners under the guise of networking. I thought she was just driven ambitious. I admired that about her, but ambition without integrity, that's a dangerous thing. When I left for that academic conference, I kissed her goodbye like always, told her I'd be back in a week. She smiled, that same smile I'd fallen in love with years ago. I had no idea it was the last time I'd see her as my wife. While I was presenting papers on moral philosophy, Elizabeth was orchestrating her exit, changing the locks, lining up her attorney, spinning stories to our friends about how I was controlling and emotionally distant. By the time I returned, she had rewritten our marriage into a narrative where she was the victim and I was the villain. It's a strange thing, realizing the person you shared a bed with had been sharing plans to destroy you behind your back. But here's the thing about teaching ethics for a living. You learn that truth has a way of surfacing, no matter how carefully someone tries to bury it. Elizabeth thought she held all the cards. She didn't know I had an ace up my sleeve, not just a trust fund, but something far more powerful: patience, and a deep understanding of what it means to let someone reveal their true character. The first night in that hotel room was the longest of my life. I sat on the edge of the bed staring at my phone, waiting for a call, a text, anything. But Elizabeth had gone silent. 15 years together, and she cut me off like I was a stranger. When I finally reached out to a mutual friend, David, someone I thought I could trust, his voice was cold. "William, I think it's best if you don't involve me in this." Elizabeth told us everything. Everything I hadn't even been told. Something. That's when I heard it for the first time, the lie that would haunt me for weeks. She said you were emotionally abusive, that she was afraid for her safety. I remember the words hitting me like a punch to the gut. Me abusive. I'd spent my entire life advocating for respect for communication. I couldn't even raise my voice during an argument, let alone threaten someone I loved. But Elizabeth had been busy, crafting a version of me that fit her agenda, and people were buying it. More calls, or rather attempts at calls. Friends ignored me. Colleagues kept their distance. Even my own sister sounded unsure when I tried to explain. It was as if I'd woken up in a world where my reputation had been stolen overnight. I didn't just lose my home, I was losing my identity. But amidst the fog of betrayal, something inside me hardened. I knew I couldn't convince everyone with words alone. Elizabeth had been too smart, too calculated. She'd planted these seeds long before I realized anything was wrong. I needed facts proof. And luckily I knew where to start. The next morning I contacted an old student of mine, Mark, who now worked as a private investigator. I didn't need to explain much. Mark had seen enough in his line of work to know that stories like Elizabeth's rarely held up under scrutiny. While Mark began digging, I met with my family's attorney. When I told him about Elizabeth's sudden move and the accusations, he wasn't surprised, Mr. Harrington. This is exactly why your grandfather structured the trust the way he did. No one can touch it, not even a spouse. It's legally separate property. For the first time in days, I felt a flicker of control returning. Elizabeth could smear my name. She could lock me out of the house. But she couldn't get her hands on that trust fund. Still, that wasn't enough. I didn't want to just survive this. I wanted the truth exposed. A week later, Mark called me with news. William, you're going to want to sit down for this. Elizabeth hadn't just been planning a divorce. She'd been having an affair for over a year with one of her wealthiest clients. Business trips, late meetings, weekend retreats, all excuses to spend time with him, while I stayed home grading papers and believing she was chasing her career dreams. But it didn't stop there. Mark uncovered emails, hotel receipts, even photos. Elizabeth and her lover had been discussing my finances, plotting how to secure the best possible settlement before she made her move. She thought I was just a naive professor with a pension and a modest savings account. She had no idea about the millions quietly managed by family attorneys. The betrayal cut deeper than I thought possible. It wasn't just about love lost. It was about being used systematically coldly by someone I once trusted with my life. But now I had leverage. I wasn't going to confront her in a rage. No, that's what she expected. That's the narrative she'd already sold to everyone else. Instead, I let my lawyer do the talking. When Elizabeth's attorney sent over demands, alimony half of my retirement claims that she'd sacrificed her career for my success, my legal team responded with precision, documented evidence of her thriving interior design business, funded largely by my contributions, proof of her affair, and a clear statement that the trust fund was off limits, protected by law, untouchable. I could almost hear the panic on the other side. Elizabeth had built her future on a fantasy one where I'd crumble under pressure and pay out just to make it all go away. But I wasn't that man anymore. This wasn't just about money. It was about standing up for myself and letting Elizabeth's own actions dismantle the story she'd crafted. The official divorce proceedings began 2 weeks later. I walked into that courtroom knowing exactly who I was dealing with now. Elizabeth sat across from me, poised, confident, dressed like the picture of a wronged wife. If I didn't know better, I might have believed her act myself. She didn't look at me. Not once, but I could see the smirk tugging at the corner of her mouth when her lawyer outlined their demands. Alimony half of my retirement account, a claim on our house. And of course, a veiled suggestion that further emotional distress could lead to additional compensation. It was a performance one she had rehearsed in her mind for months. But Elizabeth still believed she was negotiating with the man she locked out of his own home. The man who would fold under pressure. The man she thought she had destroyed. She had no idea that every lie, every betrayal was about to come crashing down on her. When my attorney calmly slid the folder across the table, the room shifted. Inside were detailed financial records showing Elizabeth's successful business ventures, funded by my personal accounts. There were also transcripts, emails, and messages between her and her lover discussing how to maximize the payout from this divorce. And finally, the pièce de resistance photos of Elizabeth on multiple trips with him, time-stamped to the nights she claimed to be working late. For the first time, Elizabeth's mask cracked. Her eyes darted across the table, searching for an escape route that didn't exist. Her lawyer's face turned pale as he flipped through the evidence. It was clear any move forward would expose Elizabeth's deceit publicly. Perjury, bad faith negotiations, infidelity. It was all there. The judge hadn't even ruled yet, but everyone in that room knew how this was going to end. Elizabeth's voice, once so sharp and commanding, was reduced to a whisper as she leaned into her attorney. They requested a recess. I stepped outside, the weight of years lifting off my shoulders, but it wasn't satisfaction I felt. It was something closer to grief. Not for the marriage that had died long before the locks were changed, but for the illusion I had lived in, for the man I used to be trusting, perhaps too naive. When they returned, the tone had shifted entirely. Gone were the demands. In their place was a quiet offer. Elizabeth would forego alimony and any claim to my retirement if we could settle quickly and discreetly. It was over. She knew it. I knew it. The house, I let her keep it. I didn't want walls filled with memories tainted by lies. All she walked away with were her personal belongings and the business I had unknowingly bankrolled. As for the trust fund, she never got a cent. She never even knew how close she had been to a future she could have shared. If only greed hadn't consumed her. But even as the paperwork was signed, I realized there was no going back to who I was before. This wasn't just a divorce. It was a breaking point. The moment I understood that some betrayals don't just end relationships, they redefine you. I wasn't the quiet, accommodating professor anymore. I had learned that silence in the face of manipulation isn't noble, it's dangerous. Elizabeth thought she won when she locked me out of that house. But the truth is, that was the day I was finally set free. Walking out of that courthouse, I didn't feel victorious. I felt resolved Elizabeth was out of my life. But so was the version of me who thought patience and kindness could fix everything. For days after the settlement, I kept thinking, what now? I had the financial security most people could only dream of, thanks to the trust fund my grandfather left behind. But money wasn't the point. It never was. Elizabeth's betrayal had exposed something deeper. A lack of integrity, not just in her, but in the people who so easily believed her lies. Friends who never asked for my side. Colleagues who distanced themselves without a word. I could have disappeared. Bought a place far away, started fresh where no one knew my name, but running wasn't in my nature, not anymore. Instead, I decided to turn this chapter of my life into something meaningful. Not revenge driven by anger, but a statement, a reminder that character matters more than perception. First, I made a quiet call to my attorney. We restructured a portion of the trust fund, $501, to establish something I called the Harrington Scholarship for Ethics and Integrity. It was designed for students who had demonstrated moral courage, those who stood up for what was right even when it cost them. I wanted to invest in people who embodied the values that had been so absent in my marriage. News of the scholarship spread quickly across campus. It didn't take long for word to reach the same social circles where Elizabeth had once painted me as a monster. Suddenly, the emotionally abusive husband was being praised for supporting young minds committed to honesty and principle. I wasn't doing it for image, but I won't lie, it felt good to watch the narrative shift. Elizabeth, on the other hand, wasn't so lucky. Her business, once thriving, thanks to referrals from our mutual connections, began to falter. Clients grew wary as whispers of her affairs surfaced, not from me, but from those who finally saw through her facade. Her wealthy lover. He disappeared as soon as the dust settled. Turns out he wasn't interested in a partner without a financial windfall. I never reached out to her. There was nothing left to say, but I did hear from a mutual acquaintance that Elizabeth had to sell the house within 6 months to cover debts from her failing business. Poetic in a way, the same walls she locked me out of became too heavy for her to keep. As for me, I bought a historic home near campus. Not flashy, just a place with character, the kind that's built over time, brick by brick, with stories that mattered. I returned to teaching with a renewed purpose. My lectures on ethics weren't just academic anymore. They were personal. Students began to seek me out, not just for coursework, but for guidance. I became a mentor, the kind of person I wished I'd had when I was younger. Someone who could tell you that strength isn't measured by how loud you speak, but by how calmly you stand when the storm hits. And in the quiet evenings, I finally started writing the book I had postponed for years. A reflection on integrity in a world that often rewards deception. I didn't name names. I didn't need to. The best revenge wasn't about exposing Elizabeth publicly. It was living a life that proved her lies couldn't define me. People often think revenge is about striking back, making the other person hurt as much as you did. But real revenge, it's taking everything meant to break you and turning it into a foundation you can stand taller on. Elizabeth tried to take my home, my reputation, and my future. What she gave me instead was clarity and the freedom to rebuild on my own terms. It wasn't until the annual university gala that I truly saw how far things had shifted. I was invited as a guest of honor, not for my years of teaching, but for the scholarship I had established. As I stood at the podium, looking out over a room filled with academics, donors, and former friends who once believed Elizabeth's lies, I realized this was the moment she had never anticipated. I didn't mention her name. I didn't have to. Instead, I spoke about integrity, how true character isn't revealed when life is easy, but when everything falls apart. I talked about the students who would benefit from the scholarship, young people who understood that success built on deceit wasn't success at all. The applause that followed wasn't just polite courtesy, it was acknowledgement, a silent apology from those who had doubted me. After the speech, a few familiar faces approached people who had distanced themselves when Elizabeth's stories first spread. "William, I owe you an apology," one colleague muttered. Avoiding my eyes, I didn't know the full story. I simply nodded. There was no satisfaction in hearing it, just closure. I had learned that forgiveness doesn't mean forgetting. It means moving forward without carrying their weight. But while my life found new balance, Elizabeth continued to unravel. The whispers about her affair had turned into open conversations. Clients pulled out of contracts, former friends avoided her at social events. The image she had so carefully curated, the successful independent designer, was cracking under the pressure of reality. I heard through the grapevine that she tried to secure a loan to save her business, but with dwindling income and no stable partner to back her, banks weren't interested. 6 months after the divorce was finalized, Elizabeth was forced to sell the house, the very house she locked me out of. It was listed below market value, a desperate move to cover debts. The irony wasn't lost on me. She had thrown away 15 years of marriage, hoping for a financial windfall, only to end up with less than she started. One afternoon as I was walking through campus, I spotted her. Elizabeth dressed far simpler than I'd ever seen her, her confident stride replaced with something heavier. Our eyes met for a brief second. There was no anger, no bitterness, just silence. She looked away first. That was the last time I saw her. Some people expected me to gloat, to feel triumphant watching her fall. But the truth is, there's no joy in witnessing someone destroy themselves. Elizabeth wasn't defeated by me. She was defeated by her own choices, by the lies she told, the bridges she burned, and the greed that blinded her. As for me, I kept building. The scholarship grew thanks to additional donors inspired by the cause. I published my book, The Weight of Truth: Lessons in Integrity. It gained modest recognition, but more importantly, it opened conversations about values. In a world obsessed with appearances, I turned my home into more than just a place to live. It became a space where students gathered, where ideas about ethics weren't just theories, but guides for real life. And slowly I found peace. Not the kind that comes from revenge, served cold, but the kind that comes from knowing you never stooped to the level of those who wronged you. Elizabeth had locked me out of our home, thinking she was shutting me down. But in reality, she freed me from a life built on illusions. In the end, the fallout wasn't just hers to face. It was a reminder to everyone watching that when you trade integrity for short-term gain, there's always a price to pay. And sometimes the most powerful response is simply letting the truth do its work. It's been 3 years since that day I came home to find the locks changed. 3 years since my life, as I knew it, ended on a doorstep with a single note. But looking back now, I don't see that moment as the end anymore. It was a beginning. I've learned that betrayal doesn't define you. Your response to it does. Elizabeth thought she was taking control of the narrative. She believed that by turning people against me, by fabricating stories, she could rewrite who I was, But character isn't something that can be erased by lies. It reveals itself over time through actions in the quiet moments when no one's watching. Today, I live a life built on values I nearly forgot during those years of comfort and assumption. I mentor students who remind me daily that integrity still matters. I walk through a home that reflects who I am, not what someone else expected me to be. And I sleep peacefully knowing I never compromised who I was, even when I had every reason to retaliate with bitterness. People often ask me if I do anything differently, if I regret not fighting harder, not exposing Elizabeth publicly. But the truth is, I didn't need to destroy her. She did that all on her own. What I did was rebuild smarter, stronger, and grounded in something no one could take from me. If there's one thing my experience has taught me, it's this. Financial security can be hidden, but character, it always shows itself. You can shield assets. You can guard your reputation for a while, but sooner or later, who you truly are will surface, especially when life doesn't go according to plan. So if you ever find yourself betrayed, locked out literally or metaphorically, remember this: revenge doesn't have to be loud. It doesn't have to be cruel. Sometimes the best revenge is living a life so full of purpose, integrity, and quiet success that those who wronged you have no choice but to watch from the outside.